I always thought the hardest part of falling would be the impact. But it wasn't. It was the watch. My Casio was still ticking on my wrist, clear as a bell, even though the world had gone completely silent. 1 second, I'm securing a bolt on the 14th floor. The next, there is no floor. I didn't endopos. T scream. You don't endopos. T scream when the air is being sucked out of your lungs by the sheer speed of the drop. But here's the thing I can't explain. I saw the shadow of my own body hitting the concrete before I actually felt it. And then, the silence became a person. You know, in construction, you're taught to respect gravity from day one. It's the first thing they tell you. Gravity doesn't endopos. T have a heart. It doesn't endopos. T care if you have kids or if you're a week away from retirement. I've spent 20 years on sites across Chicago, walking steel beams like they were sidewalk curbs. I'm a practical man. Jason Reed doesn't believe in ghosts, and I sure as hell didn't endopos. T believe in, and quote, vibes, and quote, or I didn't endopos. T. Until that Tuesday. The morning started like any other. Cold coffee in a thermos, the smell of diesel exhaust, and that gray, heavy sky that looks like it's pressing down on the skyscrapers. But something felt off, dense, like the air was thicker than usual. I remember putting on my harness and checking the carabiners. I checked them twice. Then a third time. My partner, Miller, asked me if I was okay because I was staring at my hands for too long. I just told him I didn't endopos. T sleep well. But it wasn't endopos. T the sleep. It was a feeling of end quote, wait, end quote. We were up on the 14th floor of a new hotel project near the loop. The wind usually whistles through the rebar up there, a sharp, piercing sound. But that morning, the wind was dead silent. Every hammer strike from the floors below sounded like it was happening under a mile of water. Thud, thud, thud. I was working on a corner section, just a routine bolt down. I remember looking at the city below, people looking like ants, yellow cabs looking like toys. I've seen it 1,000 times. But for some reason, I kept thinking about a conversation I had with my daughter the night before. She wanted to tell me something about her school play, and I brushed her off. I told her, end quote, later, honey, daddy's tired, end quote, later, end quote. That word started looping in my head. Later, later, later. It felt like a warning I wasn't endopos. T smart enough to understand. I remember reaching for a wrench. My glove was slightly damp from the morning mist. It was such a small thing, a fraction of an inch of a slip. My boot caught the edge of a loose plank, one that shooed endopos. T have been loose, and for a split second, I was balanced on nothing but a hope. And then, the balance broke. I remember the feeling of the harness jerking. I thought, okay, the safety line will catch me. That's what it's for. I waited for that sharp tug under my armpits that would bruise my ribs, but save my life. It never came. I heard a sound, a snap, like a guitar string breaking, but much louder. Metal fatigue? A bad clip? I'll never know. All I knew was that the weight of the harness, the thing that was supposed to keep me tethered to the world of the living, suddenly became dead weight, pulling me down faster. The ground didn't endopos. T rush up at me. Not at first. It felt like the building started rushing up. I saw the 13th floor, the 12th. I saw a guy on the 10th floor eating a sandwich. He looked at me. Our eyes met for a millisecond. He dropped his sandwich. That's when the fear really hit. Not the end quote, scary movie end quote, fear. It was a cold, clinical realization. This is it, Jason. This is how the story ends. I tried to think of a prayer, but all I could think about was that I had an endopos. T told my wife where the spare key to the lawnmower was. Practical things. Stupid things. And then, that unfinished conversation with my daughter. The end quote, later end quote. That was never going to happen. The air started to change. The higher I was, the louder the wind had been. But as I fell, the sound began to dissolve. It wasn't endopos, T air anymore. It felt like I was falling through layers of static. Like a radio station going out of tune. I looked down one last time. The concrete was a gray ocean. It was coming for me. And right before I hit, the world didn't endopos, T go black. It went white. A white so bright it felt like it had a temperature. I waited for the pain. I braced every muscle in my body for the crushing reality of concrete meeting bone. I waited, and I waited. The impact, it didn't endopos, T feel like hitting concrete. It felt like walking through a door into a room that had no air, no sound, and no gravity. One moment I was bracing for the most violent end imaginable, and the next, everything just stopped. The pain I expected, it never arrived. Instead, there was this strange, unsettling sensation of being unplugged. Imagine a television being turned off, that tiny click, and then the screen goes dark, but you can still feel the static electricity in the air. That was me. I was no longer Jason Reed, the 41-year-old construction worker with a mortgage and a bad lower back. I was just a point of view. I remember trying to breathe. My mind was still screaming, "Breathe, Jason. Open your lungs." But there were no lungs. There was no chest to expand. There was no cold Chicago air to inhale. It was like I had been deleted from the physical world, but someone forgot to turn off my consciousness. And then, the most bizarre thing happened. I heard a sound, but I didn't hear it with ears. It was a low, rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It took me a second to realize what it was. It was my heart, but it wasn't inside me anymore. It sounded like it was miles away, muffled by heavy blankets, struggling to keep a rhythm that no longer belonged to me. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of detachment. It wasn't scary yet. It was just practical. I thought to myself, well, I guess that's that. The job is finished. I didn't feel sad about dying. I felt like I had just clocked out of a very long, very exhausting shift. But as that thought passed, a new sensation crept in. A coldness. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but a psychological cold. The realization that I was drifting away from everything I had ever touched, held, or loved. I tried to reach out. I wanted to grab onto something, a steel beam, a cable, a hand, anything to tether me back to the 14th floor. But my hands were gone. I looked down, or where I thought down should be. I didn't see the ground. I didn't see the ambulance or the crowd that must have been forming. I saw a vibration. Everything, the building, the street, the air itself, looked like it was made of millions of tiny, vibrating strings of light. And I was slipping between them. I was falling through the cracks of reality. That's when the silence changed. It stopped being an absence of sound and started being a presence. I wasn't alone in that void. Something was there, standing at the edge of my awareness, watching the transition. It didn't have a face. It didn't have a name. But it was heavy. It had the weight of 1,000 years. And then, the white I saw earlier began to pull. It wasn't a light at the end of a tunnel. It was more like the entire universe was being folded up like a piece of paper, and I was caught in the fold. I remember thinking one last thing before the physical world vanished completely. I never told her I liked the drawing she made. Such a small, stupid thing. But in that moment of total sensory deprivation, it felt heavier than the skyscraper I had just fallen from. I didn't go to a tunnel. Not right away. First, I was just there, hanging in the air about 20 feet above the pavement. It's strange. When you're alive, you see the world through two little windows in your face. But there, I saw everything, all at once, 360 degrees. I saw the dust settling on the hood of a parked truck. I saw a pigeon startled by the noise, fluttering onto a fire escape. And then I saw the circle of people. They were running towards something gray and crumpled near the base of the crane. I looked closer, and that's when the practical part of my brain just broke. I saw myself. I saw my yellow hard hat, cracked down the middle, lying 5 feet away from my head. I saw my work boots, the ones I'd complained about being too tight that morning. They looked so small from up here, so heavy. I watched Miller, my partner, slide down the last few feet of a ladder and sprint toward me. He was shouting something, but his voice sounded like it was coming from the other side of a thick glass wall. He looked terrified, and for the first time, I felt a wave of peace. I wanted to tell him, "Hey, Miller, it's okay. I'm right here. Look up," But as soon as I had that thought, I realized I didn't want to go back down there. That body on the ground. It looked like an old, worn-out work glove that someone had finally dropped. It wasn't me anymore. It was just something I used to wear. But then, the presence I felt earlier, it moved. It wasn't a person. It was more like a shift in the light. A thickness in the air that felt like a shadow, but it was made of gold. It didn't endopos, speak with words. It spoke with weight. It nudged me, not physically, but it directed my attention away from the chaos on the street. I felt this pull, a magnetic tug toward the center of my chest, or where my chest used to be. It was the feeling of a secret being whispered directly into my soul. The city started to fade. The skyscrapers, the sirens, the screaming, it all began to dissolve into a soft, gray mist. And that's when the fear came back. Not because of the death, but because I realized I was leaving behind the only things I had ever known how to fix. I knew how to build a hotel. I knew how to weld a beam. But I didn't endopos, know how to exist in this. The presence felt my panic. And then, I heard a voice. It wasn't endopos, Miller. It wasn't endopos, the paramedics. It was a voice that sounded like every memory I'd ever forgotten. It said, end quote, not yet, end quote. But before I could breathe a sigh of relief, the mist opened up, and I saw where I was really going. The mist didn't endopos, just clear, it transformed. The gray streets of Chicago were gone. In their place was a space that felt vast, yet strangely intimate. It wasn't endopos, a place you could measure in miles. It was a place measured in meaning. I felt that presence again. It was closer now. It didn't endopos, have a human shape, but it felt like a mountain of calm standing right next to me. And in this place, I couldn't endopos, hide. My end quote, practical end quote, armor, the tough guy, the worker, the man who never showed emotion. It all stripped away like old paint. I felt a sudden, crushing weight in my chest. It was the end quote, fear, end quote. But it wasn't endopos, the fear of the fall. It was the fear of the silence. The presence began to show me things. Not a end quote, life review end quote, like you see in movies, not a highlight reel. It was more like a map of missed connections. I saw the moment I walked through the door last Friday. My wife looked up, ready to tell me about her day, and I just grunted and turned on the TV. I saw the disappointment in the curve of her shoulders. I saw my daughter standing by the hallway with that drawing in her hand, the one I mentioned before. In this place, I could feel what she felt. I felt the tiny spark of excitement in her heart die out when I said, end quote, later, honey, end quote. That end quote, later end quote, felt like a physical wound here. I tried to speak. I wanted to yell into the void, end quote. I didn't endopos, mean it. I was just tired. I endopos, LL tell her now, end quote. But the presence just stayed silent. It was a heavy, patient silence. It was letting me sit with the realization that I had spent 41 years building structures of steel and stone, but I had left the most important things, the words of love, the end quote. I endopos, am proud of you, end quote. The end quote. I endopos, am sorry, end quote. Completely unbuilt. I felt like a man who had reached the end of a long journey only to realize he'd forgotten his keys. End quote. Is this it? End quote. I thought. End quote. Am I going to be stuck here with these unspoken words forever? End quote. The atmosphere grew thicker. The end quote, presence end quote, seemed to expand until it was everything and everywhere. It wasn't endopos, judging me. That's the thing people get wrong. It wasn't endopos, a judge. It was a mirror. It was just showing me what I had chosen to prioritize. I looked at the light. It was beautiful, yes. It was warm, but I felt a desperate, clawing need to go back. Not for the job, not for the money. I needed to finish the conversation. I remember crying, not with eyes, but with my whole being. A sob that shook the very fabric of that gray space. End quote. I endopos, am not finished, end quote. I pleaded. End quote. Please. The words, they endopos, re-still inside me. End quote. The presence moved. It felt like a giant hand gently pushing against my forehead. The warmth was overwhelming, but underneath it, there was a sharp, cold command. It didn't endopos, say it in English, but I understood it perfectly. End quote. Then go, and speak them, end quote. And then, the vast space began to shrink. The gold light turned back into the gray Chicago sky. The peace was ripped away and replaced by a sensation I wooed endopos, wish on my worst enemy. Gravity came back, and it brought all its friends. Coming back wasn't endopos, a peaceful drift. It was a car crash. Imagine being a star, vast and infinite, and then suddenly being shoved back into a narrow, broken suit of lead. That was my body. The first thing I felt was the cold. Not the end quote, spiritual end quote, cold from before, but the raw, biting wind of a Chicago afternoon hitting my skin. Then came the pain. It was a roar, a deafening, screaming symphony of broken ribs and a shattered hip. I heard a gasp. It was my own. It sounded like a drowning man finally breaking the surface. End quote. He and Apo's, S back. He and Apo's, S breathing. End quote. I heard Miller and Apo's, S voice. It wasn't Apo's, T through glass anymore. It was loud, shaky, and wet with tears. I felt hands on me. Heavy, frantic hands of the paramedics. I tried to open my eyes, but the light of the world felt dull and dim compared to what I'd just seen. I reached out, my fingers scraping against the grit of the concrete I had just fallen onto. I felt the dirt under my fingernails. It felt wonderful. I spent 3 months in the hospital, 11 surgeries, metal plates in my legs, pins in my back. The doctors called it a end quote, miracle, end quote. They talked about the angle of the fall, the way my harness partially snagged a lower beam, slowing me down just enough. They looked for physical reasons. I just nodded. I'm a practical man, remember? I didn't end Apo's, T tell them about the presence. I didn't end Apo's, T tell them about the end quote, voice end quote. That sounded like a forgotten memory. But everything has changed. I don't end Apo's, T work the high steel anymore. I take jobs on the ground now. My crew thinks I lost my nerve. They think I and Apo's, am afraid of heights. They and Apo's, wrong. I'm not afraid of falling. I'm afraid of leaving things unbuilt. The day I finally came home from the hospital, I didn't end Apo's, T go to the TV. I didn't end Apo's, T grunt a end quote, hello end quote, and head for the fridge. I sat down on the floor with my daughter. My back screamed in pain, but I didn't end Apo's, T care. I asked her to show me the drawing. She looked at me, confused at first, and then she smiled. That smile was brighter than any light I saw on the other side. I've realized something. Life doesn't end Apo's, T end when your heart stops. It ends when you run out of time to say the things that actually matter. We spend our lives building towers of glass and steel, thinking they end Apo's, LL last forever. But the only thing we truly take with us is the weight of the words we chose to speak, or the ones we chose to keep inside. I'm still a construction worker. I still believe in gravity. But now, I know that the heaviest thing in the world is an unfinished end quote, I love you, end quote. I think about that fall every single day. Not the impact, but the silence. And I'm just glad I got one more chance to break it.